Had a really interesting conversation here with Colin Clarke. We focused on the Russian Wagner Group, talking about their evolution throughout the war, what might be next after they leave Bakhmut, and the challenges that the U.S. faces trying to deal with this non-state, but also very much a part of the Russian state organization. Hope you enjoy. All right, what's going on, everyone? Joined today by Colin Clarke, the Director of Research at the Soufan Center, focused on domestic and international terrorism, international relations, and national security and geopolitics. So, Colin, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So, I was hoping to dive a little bit into the Wagner Group. It's gotten a lot of attention in Ukraine. But before we do that, of course, we'll put some links in the description so people can find you on social media and look up some of your work. But would you mind giving just a quick background of who you
Sure.
are and what you're working on now?
Yeah, Colin Clarke. I'm the director of research at the Soufan Group, which is a private intelligence and security consulting firm based in New York City. Prior to joining the Soufan Group, I spent a couple of years as a college professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and prior to that, about a decade at the RAND Corporation, where I was mostly working doing projects for the Pentagon and, to a lesser extent, the intelligence community. So my work is always focused on violent non-state actors, writ large, of which Wagner is one. But I've done a lot of work in my career, particularly early on, looking at insurgent groups, transnational terrorist groups, a lot of work on Salafi jihadi groups like Al Qaeda and Islamic State and all of their affiliates, as well as the transnational REMV, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist kind of network in all of its manifestations. So I consider myself a terrorism, violent non-state actor person writ large, and people like to kind of get into left versus right or Salafi
Sure.
jihadi, and I kind of look at it all and try to get at the motivations and TTPs of these different orgs.
I think I said Soufan Center, but you
It's Yeah,
group.
so
They're
I'm a
two different
fellow.
things, right?
Yeah, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center. I neglected to mention that as well. That's kind of the nonprofit,
Okay.
uh, think tank part of the house, but I also do work on the private sector side.
Gotcha. Awesome. And you said Wagner. I have continually said Wagner, which there's enough people out there that I respect that say Wagner. I feel like I've got to pass, but
All good. I go back and forth
okay.
sometimes. I think I was just having a conversation earlier where the person was using it. And I've now seen, I think USG, the US government now uses the V, or at least some elements of the intelligence community. So I'm being shamed into it, but I flip back and forth myself. We all know what we're talking about in any
There we
case.
go. That's a good point. So you recently had an article in let's see, Foreign Policy Research Institute talking about what happens next with the Wagner Group. But before diving into that, this is an organization that I feel like really came on the scene for a lot of people when the war in Ukraine kicked off, even a few months into it. Were you surprised at the level of involvement from Wagner in this war?
No, and I would point you back to, so at the Soufan Center, Monday through Friday, we put out something called the Daily Intel Brief, and we actually had an intel brief, where we look at between 800 and 1,200 words on a different topic that the research team decides upon. If you look at so what was it, February 22nd or 23rd, 2022, when the war kicked off. In fact, I got home that night and had seen, that this was imminent. And we had been working on a piece on Wagner because, as you probably remember, there was a lot of pre-bunking. Kind of the U.S. Was calling out a lot of the steps in the lead up to the conflict, and so we knew something was afoot. And we actually wrote an intel brief that we put out that very next day. It was composed over the late late hours that night into the next morning about what role Wagner would play, and we suggested it would play a pretty significant role. Now, I don't even think at the time, and we were pretty bullish on this, that we thought Wagner would be as involved as they are now. We just knew that, this was a group that the Kremlin relied on quite a bit, and so, I talked a little bit and forecast their role there. And that was, I think, our most viewed intel brief for the year, just because of the timing, and it
Sure.
come out, and people are still trying to get a handle on, who is this group, what's their leadership look like, what do they do, right? I think everyone said, "Oh, this is just the Russian Blackwater," and it's far more complex than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an entire I remember that coming out very early on. It's a private military company, so it's Blackwater, triple canopy type thing, but they've
Right.
got jets, tanks, and
Yeah.
are very, seem to be very, very from the beginning, very, very tied in directly with the Russian military in a way that PMCs never really have been in the U.S.
Yeah, you're right about that. And in fact, they rely on the Russian MOD, the Ministry of Defense, for things, uh, a lot of logistics, right? Lift, ammunition, all of these other things that your kind of garden variety PMC doesn't have. There's also not that same relationship between whether it's a Western PMC, South African, what have you, and the actual state. So and Wagner also has a pretty diverse portfolio. It's not just kinetic stuff. They're involved in a lot of non-kinetic activities as well, including disinformation and propaganda support to various kind of warlords and military juntas in countries where they operate. And they're quite sophisticated in that regard.
So I think that's a good leeway into this article that I'll link below. When you're talking about what happens next with Wagner, you brought up some possible operations in Africa. This is good timing because we're right in this window. We're recording on May 30th. And a few days ago, Prigozhin said that they were going to be leaving Bakhmut, transitioning out with the Ministry of Defense. Whether it seems like that's happening. I don't know if they'll actually hit that date of June 1st. I heard another say June 5th. But if they do withdraw their forces from the Bakhmut area, what's next? Where do you think they're going to end up?
Yeah, I think still a considerable amount of these folks will remain in Ukraine and maybe go back for R&R in Russia and then be redeployed to the battlefield. Especially the kind of cannon fodder type, as we've described them before, those guys that were plucked from Russian jails and prisons and thrown into the meat grinder in Ukraine. But I think that it's also a training ground in some respects for Wagner to take a look at the most capable fighters there, folks that might have the promise of a more elite style troop, and redirect them to expeditionary operations outside of the battlefield. I mean, I've long made the contention that what you're seeing in Ukraine is really not Wagner's comparative advantage whatsoever. That really what they're built for and what they're good at is deploying to places like the Central African Republic, Mali, and elsewhere, providing that kind of very heavy-handed, almost draconian counterinsurgency style support to local, military chieftains throughout these areas, and in exchange for concessions, extracting concessions for various mining rights, diamonds, gold, all sorts of other minerals that then the Russians can use to help evade sanctions. So it's a pretty complex organization. I view it more as a kind of constellation or a universe of different companies and shell companies that kind of Prigozhin is overseeing. And I think if he were to have his way, he would be focused on those type of activities rather than being the public face of a very brutal war, which the Russians are often on the wrong side of. I mean, not only morally, but they're getting smacked around quite a bit, and he's losing a lot of men in the process, which you can kind of see his frustration where he kind of releases these rambling kind of venting videos on the internet. And there's debate over how much of this is theater versus not, but he spends a lot of his time thinking about and focusing on Ukraine rather than this kind of broader empire.
Now, he gets a lot of attention in Ukraine. I mean, it's not, these rants aside, people have been talking about Wagner now for months, and they just weren't prior to the war. So he's definitely got a spotlight. He's got attention. That doesn't seem to have been the case with some of these previous operations that were going on before the war across the Middle East and Africa. Are those more financially rewarding for him, though? Like, is it almost a decision of financial versus status in a sense?
I think that's a good way to describe it. Certainly, those other ventures are more financially rewarding and maybe of equivalent importance to the Pentagon's foreign or the Kremlin's foreign policy. When you think about the way that Russia operates, this is supposed to be a group that offers plausible deniability.
Mm-hmm.
That whole kind of smoke and mirrors is really faded over the last year. I mean, I really view these guys as a direct extension of what's happening in the upper reaches of Putin's kind of inner circle. Therefore, I think that we're likely to continue to see Wagner operate. But the question becomes, you're exactly right. Is it focused on making money, or is it to kind of raise Prigozhin's star? Because I think he's a little bit addicted to the fame. People
Yeah.
are throwing his name around as a future politician in Russia. And for a guy that used to sling sabrets in St. Petersburg, that's not a bad, upgrade.
Yeah. It's interesting, very interesting to see this play out. I was going to ask about the with the Wagner Group being this sort of paramilitary connected to the Russian state organization. I've heard of others that are popping up like them, but this seems to be the anomaly. Like this is it. Is there any reason why Wagner is so much more well known and so much more well funded than any of these others that I guess could potentially be the same?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. We're seeing, organizations like Gazprom, for example, the Russian energy giant, fielding its own kind of PMC now. Look, I think a lot of it goes to what we just spoke about, which is Prigozhin's kind of cult of personality. He clearly wants the attention, he craves the attention, and he's elevated Wagner, in some respects along those lines of being the public face. You'd think it would almost be the opposite, where they'd want to kind of hide more in the shadows, which they did for a long time. I think it was in late 2022, maybe September 2022, if I recall correctly, that he kind of came out and was like, okay, the gig's up. Really, I'm the one running the Wagner Group. A couple of months later, November of that year, they announced a big military center in St. Petersburg, right? So now it was like, okay, we're calling it what it is, what we all know it is. And I think some of these other groups are maybe learning from Prigozhin's missteps and mistakes and saying, we don't want to be publicly in the spotlight, because what has it brought them other than, personal fame for him, which, in Russia, you get too famous, you end up falling out of a window, especially if you are perceived as crossing Vladimir Putin. But I'm not sure the trade-off would be worth it for some of these other groups, some of these smaller groups that kind of want to remain more anonymous, fighting the way that they're fighting. So I think we're going to see more of these groups proliferate, but it's not easy, right? So which groups end up kind of becoming front and center in the overall campaign? I think that's yet to be seen.
Do you think there's, Russia had a lot of advantages using the Wagner Group? That, to your point, they were this non-Russian entity for a little while, and that's gone. Nobody's thinking about that anymore.
Right.
But one of the things I've heard when talking about when they were able to recruit from prisons was those casualties didn't hurt the Russian workforce. Those weren't people that were being pulled off the production line or any other sense. So, as awful as it sounds, to a degree, they were disposable to the Russian state.
They were expendable.
Is Russia able to look at how this is played out and view that as successful enough to try to replicate in other areas, as opposed to using their conventional forces?
Yeah, potentially. And I think, the question I have is, when you go from, an organization like Wagner pre this last kind of Ukraine invasion, I think of, really Russia's been at war with Ukraine since 2014. This is the kind of re-invasion, or part two of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I almost look at it as one continuous conflict. But when you talk about recruiting from prisons, the numbers or percentages that I've seen are as many as 30 or 40% of these guys have either HIV or some kind of hepatitis infection, and they're actually being, in exchange for fighting, or being given the proper medicine, right? So it's
Oh,
really
jeez.
dystopian when you think about it, in many ways. And so I wonder if the Russians will be able to kind of pull this off. And to what extent does it damage the brand, right? If you were seen as a kind of elite fighting force beforehand, and now you're just seen as a human wave attack of, prisoners that really are down and out, not really super well trained, not given cutting edge equipment, it makes you think, like, is this the organization that I want to join? Now I understand it's a mercenary group and it's pay for play, but they're, the branding matters, I think, in a certain respect, right? When we think about folks like Dmitry Yevkin, one of the operational commanders, right, former Spetsnaz, there's a lot of, I think, bona fides that Wagner had, that now you're kind of like, well, are they that special? Are they that unique? Are they just, this kind of 50-pound sledgehammer that Prigozhin talks about, right? Just kind of thrown in to do damage there. So, what what impact has the conflict in Ukraine had, positive or negative, and what does that mean for the group's future?
Now they're not in. They haven't made that shift entirely, right? They do still have some, comparatively elite forces or better trained forces. Um, do you have any idea what that split is within the organization?
That's something that a lot of researchers are digging in on. I will say this: think about the optics. Um, if those forces are being held in reserve, it tells you a little bit about how important Ukraine is to Putin, right? Is this an existential conflict, like many are being told? Look, we have to, go to Ukraine and fight. Well, if that's the case, why aren't we putting forth our best, forces, right? Why are they kind of being held in reserve? Is this just, a pet project that Putin kind of dreamed up during COVID isolation? And I think there's some of that, going down that rabbit hole of, documents that he's, discovered and kind of reread in his revisionist history. But if this were an, existential threat to the Russian people, as they often try to portray it, and not just a special military operation, why hold back?
And it's been an interesting the fallout, the comments, the information space since the fall of Bakhmut has been interesting because a lot of rather pro-Russian accounts have been Wagner beat back this well-trained Ukrainian force. You're thinking you're hyping Wagner above the Russian Ministry of Defense. At this we know there's prisoners there, and to your point, the HIV, hepatitis with some of these men, like why are they being viewed as the more robust, more efficient fighting force? That doesn't seem like something Russia would want to promote.
No, nor are they necessarily too willing. I mean, there's stories of individuals, Wagner recruits, trying to flee the battlefield and being executed, quite simply. So if you're fighting for your freedom, 6 months of fighting, and if you survive, you can kind of be released from prison. The morale there, the esprit de corps has to be quite low. In addition to the imminent Ukrainian counteroffensive, what we've just seen this week alone, drone attacks in Moscow. So there's so much to this. I think the psychology to pick apart that really leads to these interesting questions about what's the view from St. Petersburg, from Moscow, from some of these outer areas where Russian citizens may begin to question, what's really going on here. The other part of it is, and I wrote a piece maybe a few months back that was published in the Wall Street Journal. What happens if and when these individuals start coming home in large numbers, at least those that survive, because casualty count is quite high. But where do they fit into society? Certainly, they're not going to be reintegrated. They're not going to go become teachers and bakers and auto mechanics. They're going to be foot soldiers for organized crime. And so in the piece, I kind of posit, could we see a return to early 1990s style, Wild West in Russia, where you had just this huge spike in contract killings, post Cold War, where you had individuals reinforcing these criminal groups. Now, they have a limited skill set. How do they then employ that, and does that cause domestic political instability in Russia?
That's a good point. Are you familiar with there's a YouTube channel I think called 1420 where somebody goes around Russia asking questions of ordinary
I haven't
citizens?
seen that. No, that sounds
It's
like
interesting because it's kind of like a read on the citizens, but you can tell there's certain places where they're like, nope, not going to say any more on that. But there was one where they asked about the Wagner Group. What's your perception of the musicians, or however they phrased it? And there were a couple, kids, 15 to 18 years old, that said they're badass. And I
wow.
think Wagner's done a good job in a sense of what they put out it's great marketing.
Yeah.
They're not showing pictures of those prisoners that are under equipped. They're showing some of their top notch guys all kitted out. So, I think maybe a balancing act, but I think they have done a good job in a sense of kind of still presenting that image of an elite force.
Sure. No, and it's fascinating, like that the marketing aspect, right? Because that does matter. Islamic State reminded us of that in a way to kind of put out these, really expertly edited, sophisticated, slick propaganda that was, had a real impact on recruitment, and they were able to draw in, significant numbers of foreign fighters from all over the world. So I think, other violent non-state actors look at that, and now it's a necessity, right, to kind of have that media presence, to have that ability, that almost kind of PR awareness, if you will.
Speaking of Islamic State, there's been a push recently, and I think some European countries have actually done it, but to declare the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization. Now, I jumped on the government site listing the uh, international, the foreign terrorist organizations. It's much shorter than I thought it would be. But what's the impact there if the U.S. were to do that? Because on the one hand, we're saying that, the gig's up, guys. We know that you are essentially a Russian military organization, but then we're also, on the other hand, talking about them being a terrorist organization. How does that? What's the move there?
Yeah, so it's and as you will have noticed, the majority of groups on that list are Islamic, jihadist style
Mm-hmm.
organizations, and I think, to me, a terrorist group's a terrorist group. Now, what is Wagner? It's a bit of a kind of odd duck, right? Because of what you just mentioned, it's a Russian proxy. There's this kind of, you know, veneer of obfuscation that Wagner attempts. There's so many different kind of criteria that a group would have to meet to be there. But in cases like this, I look to experts. I look to folks like Jason Blazakis, my colleague at the Soufan Center and at the Soufan Group, who used to actually be the head of the designation office at the
All
Department of
right.
State. So it was his decision. He designated Haqqani, for example, right? And he says, yes, I absolutely think Wagner meets the criteria, should be listed as a foreign terrorist organization. In addition to it's currently listed as a TCO, transnational criminal organization. But beyond that, listing it as an FTO would give the government, law enforcement, intelligence agencies more authorities to counter this group and combat it wherever they operate globally. And I'm in favor of that as well.
I saw an article that I saw pop up, and it may have been from you or on your Twitter page, but it's talking about it in Australia. One of the benefits of that is that they can clamp down on local support for that organization. So, like today, I'm getting into Australian law, which is, I don't know, I hardly know American law, but um, it essentially, you can support Russia all you want, wave your Russian flag all you want, but that would make it to where, putting a Wagner flag on your front door is a crime. Is that a little bit of this as well, you think?
Yeah, I think it's just extending out beyond kind of what we're already doing. I mean, the U.S. has been kind of pushed into this reluctantly. I think, if you take the Sahel, for example, in Africa, Wagner is filling power vacuums and actively destabilizing countries where we have, the U.S. has pretty significant interests, and so it becomes this weird catch-22 where Wagner is brought in to kind of stabilize the country, but all of their actions, including committing war crimes, further destabilizes the country, which they then argue, look, it's not stable here. You need us. There's a greater demand signal for their services. So it's this kind of cyclical chicken and egg situation. But they've been able to spin it in a way where when they come to a country, they're coming as this kind of savior-like role to fight against groups like JNIM, the Al Qaeda linked jihadist group that's active throughout parts of West Africa, to fight against Islamic State affiliates in that area. Now, what they don't say is they also commit crimes against civilians. They kind of go in with this scorched earth approach, which then leads to further destabilization, and it pushes civilians that wouldn't have otherwise to join these jihadist groups for protection, out of fear, for revenge, all these other reasons. So it's a very messy situation there. The French and the U.S. have kind of limited footprint on the ground. And so I think we're likely to see more of that creeping over these very porous borders. There's a big fear. Do they move into coastal West Africa? Do they expand throughout the rest of the African continent? And I think they're actually far more pervasive than most folks realize. The Discord leaks mention that they have been active in already 13 different countries throughout Africa.
And there was a map, I'm sure you saw that in the background of one of Prigozhin's recent speeches, and everybody jumped on that to say that must be where they're operating. And it was even more than that, I think, right?
Yeah, and so was that a kind of psyop? Was that a ploy? He's a wily figure
Yeah.
to pin down, and so I'll take that with a grain of salt. But we do know also from the Discord leaks that they were knocking on the door in Haiti, offering their services there. That they tried to act as a kind of middleman, reaching out to contacts in Turkey for weapons that they could get for the battlefield. So these guys have their fingers in all sorts of different pies. And if the United States and its allies don't put together an actual coherent strategy to counter this group, we're going to be left holding the bag in many of these countries, scratching our heads saying, oh, how did Russia spread its influence, so comprehensively in these areas? Well, here's how. We're watching it happen in real time, and we're often caught flat-footed, kind of, well, how do we respond? They're not a traditional terrorist organization. To me, this is the kind of hangover from 20 years of fighting the global war on terrorism, where we focused almost exclusively not only just on terrorism, but on one type of terrorism, right? It was
Sure.
Sunni extremism. And now it's kind of, now we're saying, well, we're done doing counterterrorism anyway. It's all about great power competition. And if you're not talking about China, I don't even want to talk to you. But if we are going to do counterterrorism, this doesn't fit our mold. And so I think we're kind of dumbfounded a little bit of how to deal with this group. Now that's bad in and of itself, but I also think it sets a bad precedent for the future. And I think other adversaries, including the Chinese, will learn from this, and they will seek to kind of emulate that, whether it's in a future conflict in Taiwan or elsewhere, of saying, look, all you have to do is trot out these little green men, and it'll buy you enough time where it kind of causes the U.S. to sit there and say, hey, what's happening here?
Yeah.
And by that time, it may be a fait accompli on the battlefield.
I think that's a great point. That nice gray area between a very obvious non-state actor and a state actor. I mean, it worked. It worked in Ukraine for a long time until 2022. It seemed to be accomplishing Russia's tasks. So 8 years of watching it play out, and we didn't have a great way to figure that out. And add to this, I'd say that Wagner is fighting Islamic State in a lot of places, right? So
Sure.
they're
I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So, but because go back to 2018 in Syria, right, where we're operating, the Russians are operating, we're trying to deconflict. Hey, there's these dudes that are getting a bit aggressive toward our folks, and what does the kind of high-level Russian MOD say? Not our guys, right? And is that a reflection of kind of internal maneuvering between Wagner and kind of Russian military? I don't have to finish the story there. A lot of these guys were wiped out pretty easily. So, I think when we go toe to toe with Wagner, it's not a capability issue. I mean, U.S. forces, particularly special forces, will wipe the floor with these dudes. It's a matter of, where are they operating? What are the authorities, right? What's the kind of broader context where we're coming up against some of these forces? And moreover, let's go back to kind of building partner capacity and security cooperation. How do we help our friends and allies in some of these fragile states? So either A, they know how to deal with Wagner, or B, Wagner doesn't have the opportunity to go there in the first place. They don't have that opening where they get invited, where someone's saying, maybe this is a good alternative. But we're tied with one hand behind our back in some respects, because we have things like Leahy vetting, right? We have human rights principles that go along with our training. Wagner, there's no strings attached. Hey, you want someone to come in and crack skulls, not ask questions? Cool. Here's a couple of leases to these diamond mines.
I can see the. I mean, you can see the attraction.
Yeah, I mean,
especially
for a military junta and a dictator or a warlord, 100%, it makes perfect sense.
I read or heard something recently where they're talking about how some of these groups in Africa were putting Russian license plates, fake Russian license plates, to make it look like they had the support of Wagner to intimidate their rivals. Like that was the messaging.
We used to see things like that with ISIS, right? Guys were going around using the ISIS name to scare others, to extort money, until ISIS then found out about it. This happens all the time. It happens in the US with the Bloods and the Crips, right? People are going around using these kind of brands, if you will, to get what they want.
Well, as we wrap up here, a contentious question, I think it's just purely opinion. But when it comes to Prigozhin, do you think that he has broader ambitions outside of what he's doing right now, maybe inside of Russia? Or do you expect him to kind of fade a little bit maybe and focus on some of their more external operations?
It's really hard to know concretely, but I would say, for, again, a guy that started off as a hot dog vendor, he's playing with house money in certain respects, right? Think about how his star has risen. If he were smart, he might call in his winnings and go home, and go find a nice place to retire. Maybe on the Black Sea somewhere, or in the broader Russian diaspora. I don't know. But I don't, he doesn't strike me as that kind of guy. I think he's the type that's going to go down in a blaze of glory, which, it might come to that if he continues to kind of put out these videos and insult folks like, Shoigu or Gerasimov, or, potentially even Putin. There was speculation, was that grandpa comment that he made an offhand reference to Putin? So I don't think you can continue to kind of sling arrows like that and live for too long in that atmosphere. I think for him, and you know, one of the things I speculated was all these ranting videos was a way to force his hand, to force the Kremlin's hand, so Wagner could move out of Ukraine, right? Because I think even Prigozhin knows, like, this isn't his specialty. These guys shouldn't be fighting conventional conflict. They're made for expeditionary operations. They're built for something completely different. You know, he pegs himself as a Russian patriot for even considering putting Wagner in this role. Okay, now it's time to you know, to relocate, to deploy the forces elsewhere. We'll see if he gets his wish. If he continues to kind of straddle both worlds, I think, you know, his kind of popularity may come to an end sooner than he'd like it to.
Interesting. I mean, he's a complicated figure in a complicated group and a complicated war. So there's a lot of variables there. But Colin, thank you so much for taking the time. Where's a good place for people to connect with you online, and where can they do that? Just ask that question
Sure.
twice.
Yeah. On Twitter, I'm at Colin P. Clarke. And then, you know, we put out analyses through the Daily Intel Brief on the SuFunCenter.org. So please come check out our work. And thanks again for having me. Really appreciate the conversation.
Absolutely. So we'll get all those links in the description below. Take care, Colin, and hope to stay in touch.
Thanks so much.